On the morning of March 4th, 1933, a 31-year-old factory worker named Harold Briggs woke up in Detroit, got dressed, and walked 6 blocks to the First National Bank of Michigan to withdraw $40, money he had saved over 4 months to pay his rent and buy food for his family through the winter. The doors were locked. A handwritten sign on the glass said, "Closed by order of the governor. No deposits, no withdrawals, no exceptions." Harold stood on that sidewalk for a long time. He had no food at home for the following week. He had no other savings. He had no way to reach his money. The bank wasn't robbed. It wasn't on fire. It was simply closed. And the $40 he had saved, legally deposited, dutifully accumulated, was completely unreachable. What happened next is one of the most important financial stories in American history, and almost nobody knows it. Within 48 hours of that morning, 38 states had declared bank holidays. Not one bank, not one state. 38 states simultaneously suspended access to deposits. By the time Franklin Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday on March 6th, virtually every bank in the United States was closed. An estimated $25 billion in deposits, the savings of millions of ordinary Americans, was frozen solid. People couldn't buy groceries. They couldn't pay rent. They couldn't access a single dollar of money that was legally theirs. And here is what the history books skip over entirely. The people who survived that week without catastrophe were not the ones with the most money in the bank. They were the ones who had learned, through hard experience or from parents who had lived through earlier crashes, that the bank is not a vault. It is a promise. And promises, as 1933 proved, can be suspended by a governor's signature on a Tuesday morning. Stay with me. Because what those families knew, and what the financial system has spent 90 years making sure you don't think about, is the difference between surviving a financial collapse and being destroyed by one. And I'm going to show you exactly how they did it and what it means for your money right now. Before I go further, I want to tell you something about Harold Briggs, because his story doesn't end on that sidewalk. Harold had a neighbor named Walt. Walt was a quiet man who worked at the same factory and earned the same wages. When the bank holiday hit, Walt did not go to the bank. He already knew the doors were locked, not because he had inside information, but because his father, who had lived through the panic of 1907, had told him something years earlier that Harold's father had never said. Walt had 3 months of expenses in cash at home, not in a checking account, not in a savings account, in an envelope in a locked drawer in his bedroom. He had a pantry with enough preserved food to last his family 8 weeks, and he had a network of 4 neighbors with whom he had been quietly trading skills and goods for 2 years. When the banks closed, Walt made breakfast, went to work, and came home. The crisis that devastated Harold's week was, for Walt, a Tuesday. That is not luck. That is architecture. Walt had built a financial structure that did not depend on the bank being open. And the principles behind that structure, every single one of them, are available to you right now, regardless of your income, regardless of your savings, regardless of what the Federal Reserve does next week. Let me show you how Walt built it. And let me show you the numbers behind what it means for your life today. The first thing Walt understood is something that sounds simple and is almost never practiced. Money you cannot touch is money you do not have. This is not a metaphor. In March 1933, it was literal. $25 billion in deposits existed on paper and could not be accessed by the people it belonged to. The deposits were real. The access was not. Today, the equivalent is more subtle, but the mechanism is identical. When your entire liquid savings sits in a checking account, tied to a debit card, tied to a banking system that can experience outages, cyber attacks, institutional failures, or regulatory freezes, you are Harold on the sidewalk. You have money. You cannot reach it. The outcome is the same. Walt kept a physical cash reserve equivalent to 3 months of his household expenses. He didn't keep it in one place. He split it, some at home in a locked drawer, some with his sister 2 miles away, some converted into small denomination coins that he kept in a coffee can in the root cellar. Not because he was paranoid, because he had watched his father navigate the panic of 1907 with exactly this system and come out without losing a single night of sleep. Here is what this costs in 2025. The median American household spends roughly $4,200 per month on essential expenses: housing, food, utilities, transportation, insurance. 3 months of that is $12,600. That is the target. That is Walt's envelope. Most financial advisors will tell you to keep that in a high-yield savings account. And for most scenarios, that's correct. But Walt's lesson, and the lesson of March 1933, is that a portion of that reserve needs to exist outside the digital banking system entirely. Not all of it. A portion. Enough that if the system goes down on a Tuesday morning, you can buy groceries on Wednesday. The Federal Reserve's own 2024 survey found that 37% of American adults can't cover a $400 emergency. That number is a symptom of something deeper. The complete outsourcing of financial security to institutions that have demonstrated repeatedly that they can fail, freeze, or close without warning. Walt didn't outsource his security. He held it. The second thing Walt understood is that preserved food is frozen money. This is the part of Depression-era financial strategy that sounds like a prepper fantasy and is actually one of the most sophisticated forms of inflation hedging ever practiced by ordinary people. When Walt's wife put up 60 jars of tomatoes in August, she was not just canning food. She was locking in the August price of tomatoes for the following February. If tomato prices doubled by winter, which they often did, she had already bought them at summer prices. The jar in the root cellar was worth more in February than it cost in August. Every jar was a small, edible hedge against food inflation. Consider what this means in 2025. The USDA reports that food prices have increased roughly 25% since 2020. A family that bought and preserved a 6-month supply of staples, rice, beans, canned goods, dried pasta, cooking oil, in early 2020 effectively locked in prices that are now 25% cheaper than current market rates. That is not a lifestyle choice. That is a financial strategy with a documented, calculable return. The average American family spends roughly $1,200 per month on food. A strategic 3-month pantry, built gradually over time, rotated and replenished, costs roughly $2,500 to establish and saves the household an estimated $300 to $500 per year in protection against food price inflation, bulk purchase discounts, and emergency grocery costs. Over 10 years, even at the conservative end of that estimate, that's $3,000 saved. Invested at 7%. $4,100 from a pantry. But here's the number Walt actually cared about. When the bank closed and Harold couldn't buy food, Walt fed his family from the root cellar for 8 weeks without spending a single dollar. The pantry didn't just save money, it bought time. And in a financial crisis, time is the only currency that matters. The third thing Walt understood would get him laughed out of most financial planning offices today. And it is the reason he never once had to sell an asset at the wrong time. Walt did not own stocks. This is not investment advice. Walt's situation was specific to 1933, but the principle underneath it is worth examining carefully, because it applies directly to the way most people think about financial security today. Walt's assets were physical and productive. He owned tools. He owned preserved food. He owned the skills to produce things people needed. He had a greenhouse where he grew vegetables year-round. He had a set of woodworking tools that allowed him to do repairs for neighbors in exchange for goods and services. Every asset he owned produced something: food, shelter, warmth, or value for others. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and continued falling until 1932, Walt lost nothing. Not because he was clever, because he had nothing in the market to lose. His wealth was stored in forms that did not correlate with the financial system's collapse. Now, in 2025, the complete avoidance of financial markets is not practical or advisable for most people. The stock market has historically returned roughly 7% annually over long periods, and that compounding is genuinely powerful. The lesson from Walt is not to avoid markets. The lesson is to never store all of your security in a single system, especially one that can be closed, frozen, or crashed before you finish your morning coffee. The practical translation is this: Walt's three-bucket approach: liquid physical cash, productive physical assets, and community-based exchange networks represents a form of diversification that no brokerage account can replicate. If your entire net worth is in a 401k and a checking account, you are Harold. If a portion of your security exists in physical, productive, community-connected form, you are Walt. The difference between Harold and Walt in March 1933 was not income. They earned the same wage. It was not luck. It was not timing. It was architecture, the deliberate, patient construction of a financial life that did not require any single institution to remain open in order to function. Now, I need to tell you something that most financial content won't say directly. The banking system is safer today than it was in 1933. The FDIC insures deposits up to $250,000. The Federal Reserve has tools that didn't exist then. The probability of a 1933-style bank holiday in 2025 is low, but low is not zero. In March 2023, 90 years almost to the month after Harold stood on that sidewalk, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in 48 hours. It was the second largest bank failure in American history. Customers with deposits above the FDIC limit lost access to their money for days. Businesses couldn't make payroll. The contagion spread to Signature Bank and First Republic within weeks. The Treasury stepped in. The crisis was contained. But for 72 hours, the people who were Walt, who had liquidity outside the system, who had reserves that didn't depend on SVB's servers being online, experienced a Tuesday. The people who were Harold experienced something considerably more frightening. The question is never whether the system will fail. It is whether you have built something that works when it does. Here is what Walt's complete system looked like, translated into numbers that apply to a median American household in 2025. 3 months of essential expenses in liquid form, with a portion held physically outside the banking system, $12,600. A strategic pantry covering 3 months of food at preserved and bulk prices, $2,500 to establish. A basic toolkit allowing household repairs and skill exchange with neighbors, $800, purchased gradually over 1 year. A single productive asset, a garden, a skill, a tool that generates value, generating between $500 and $2,000 per year in direct savings or barter value. Total capital required to build Walt's system from scratch, roughly $16,000, accumulated over 2 to 3 years at a pace of $500 per month, set aside specifically for this purpose. Total protection generated. The ability to function for 3 months with zero income, zero bank access, and zero emergency spending, while your invested assets remain untouched, compounding, waiting for the crisis to pass. That is not a prepper fantasy. That is what a factory worker in Detroit built on a modest wage in the early 1930s, because his father told him to. And when March 1933 came, it worked exactly as designed. I want to close with Harold. Harold Briggs did not lose everything in 1933. The bank holiday ended after 8 days. Deposits were eventually accessible again. He was shaken, hungry for a week, and forced to borrow money from a cousin to cover his rent, a debt that took him 8 months to repay. But Harold learned something that week that he carried for the rest of his life. He learned that security is not a number in an account. It is a system you build layer by layer before you need it. He started that week with almost nothing, building what Walt already had. By 1940, Harold had 3 months of cash outside the bank, a pantry his wife restocked every autumn, and a set of tools he used to help his neighbors in exchange for goods and labor. He never again stood on a sidewalk wondering how he was going to feed his children. He built Walt's system. 7 years late, but he built it. You don't have to wait for the doors to close to start. Pick one layer this week. Open a separate savings account and move $100 into it with a label that says, "Do not touch." Buy 10 extra cans of food at the grocery store and put them in a box in your closet. Learn one skill you currently pay someone else to do. That is the first brick. Walt didn't build his system in a day. He built it in 10 years, one decision at a time, because his father handed him a principle that the banking industry would prefer you never receive. Now you have it. If this changed the way you think about where your real security lives, subscribe, because every week this channel goes deeper into the financial architecture that the system doesn't teach. And leave one comment. Are you Harold or Walt right now? I want to know where you're starting from. I read every single one. The banks can close. What you build outside them cannot.